So, Epitaph Records, the record company that's been around since the 1980s, that's been producing many great bands like The Offspring, Pennywise, Bad Religion, of course, and many others that have risen onto the scene ever since the 80s, and even still today they produce some newer bands, and even a few recently that have gotten a little bit of fame over the past even like 15 years, like Falling in Reverse, Escape the Fate, and many other great bands that have been brought up over the past 15 years. And I am here to mainly give the story of how Epitaph Records started and where it's gotten in today's day and age. So we'll start with the beginning here. So the beginning actually was of Bad Religion not knowing where to produce their records, not knowing what record label to produce it on. So they made up their own just for the hell of it. And just for the hell of it as well, they called it Epitaph, which was a lyric out of one of their original songs from their first album. And currently, still to this day, Brett Garowitz, the guitarist of Bad Religion, owns this record label and manages it. And of course, after Bad Religion started to get some attention, they signed some other bands such as the Vandals that were doing similar music that they were during the time, and got them on the record label, and they also managed to garner a little bit of fame throughout the whole punk rock scene that was going on throughout the 80s with bands such as the Vandals, Bad Religion, and even bands like Dead Kennedys. And during this time, they signed bands that had all sorts of different like styles and topics. It was just absolutely insane how much they really had to offer as of like different types of sound that they were putting into the record label. And even still today, there's so much of a variety of sound, even more today than there was back then. But we're talking about the punk rock scene, which is what it mainly was in the 1980s with bands like I said, Bad Religion and Vandals. And there was also another record label that bands such as the Vandals, Down by Law, which were both bands that were signed to Epitaph eventually were on, and that was Kung Fu Records. And this was a record label that many bands in the 80s before Epitaph started were on. Even Blink-182 actually did their Buddha EP on Kung Fu Records back in the day. And the Vandals wrote about pretty much every topic in punk you could imagine, such as going against the establishment, relationships, or social life, what have you. It's all in their music. They have pretty much every kind of punk song you could imagine, from My Girlfriend's Dead to Cafe 405 to People That Are Going to Hell. And in 1989, actually, NoFX was starting to rise up on the scene and actually produced a record called S&M Airlines that was made on Epitaph Records. And NoFX actually later went on to make their own record label called Fat Records, and which is also a sister record to Epitaph Records, much like Hellcat is, which was formed by Tim Armstrong of Rancid. But NoFX still released a few records for sure on Epitaph Records, including Punk and Drublic, which was released in the 90s. But now we'll get to the 90s, which is where the most massive explosion happened. And this includes Punk and Drublic by NoFX, and Out Come the Wolves by Rancid, and Smash by The Offspring, and many other albums that went platinum completely, just sold out copies. And it was at the point where they had to get complete fucking warehouses full of records just to get these things out there because they were selling so much. And during this time, there were so many more bands that were on this record label, probably some that I don't even know about because there's literally that many. Along with the 2000s, but the 90s as well were a time where so many other bands got signed to this record label. Probably some of them I haven't even listened to, I feel like. But I've listened to a lot of them for sure, and I've definitely liked most of them. Like Pennywise, NoFX, Bad Religion, Rancid, Pulley. There's just so many others I can name off the top of my head. They were like in the 90s and that whole skate punk era. And Epitaph Records, I will point out, is one of the biggest record labels to go to as of 90s skate punk. And that's one of the reasons why it's probably my favorite record label of all time. Along with the fact that they work for you rather than you working for them. which is what it's like on certain other huge record labels. Now we're going to talk about the 2000s of Epitaph. And in the 2000s, in the early part of the 2000s, there are many bands still getting signed for sure, though they weren't at their peak like they were in the 90s. Though they still had some fame going on for sure, though, with, of course, new albums coming out from bands that have been appreciated the most, like Pennywise and NoFX. There are also many other bands like Pulley and 10 Foot Pole, Oscar, that were getting signed, and they got a little bit of attention, not as much as like Pennywise or NoFX, but they still got a little bit of attention. But of course they didn't sell as much as they did during, like, when Smash was released, or when Punk and Drublic was released, or Out Come the Wolves. They didn't sell as many as that. They were still absolutely great records, they just didn't sell as much. Though I think this era of Epitaph was still a great era of Epitaph, and I definitely listened to a lot of stuff from that era of Epitaph. In my eyes, it was just mainly a slightly underappreciated era of Epitaph. But still, there were so many other great bands out there in the 2000s that I listened to during the time, including ones that were signed to other record labels. And really, they just added to the experience, you know? So I will definitely not say that the 2000s were a bad time for music, because in my eyes they certainly weren't, because there was so much different kind of stuff going on during the time, much like the 90s. And the 2010s is where things really started getting interesting for Epitaph. The 2010s till now, things have really started to get interesting as of different kind of bands that have been getting signed, different people that have been getting signed. Like now we have stuff that I could have never imagined Epitaph, you know, signing. Not that I necessarily am dissing on those people, because, you know, it's a good message they're sending out there, though, you know, some of it may just not be my cup of tea. I haven't listened to all of it, though. I may listen to some of it and just, you know, give it a chance. I've listened to a few of these, you know, little rappers have, maybe one or two of their songs, and I wasn't too much of a fan. I wasn't really feeling it all the way. Though, no offense to people that, of course, you know, it have that as their cup of tea, you know what I mean? Because I guess I just grew up in a little bit of a different era, like the skate punk era and the 2000s era, where, you know, everyone had a band that shamelessly ripped off NoFX and shit like that. Though I believe, you know, a little bit of change at times sometimes can be a good thing, because a certain style, of course, does get bland after a while. But, you know, it's always good to have a revitalization of it, of course, every now and then. And I definitely do want that for 2020 for sure, because I miss that era so much, and I would love to have a revitalization of it just for that, you know, nostalgia, and, you know, just going out there and having a good time and having the music cranked up to the max, having like good drum beats, like NoFX drum beats, that kind of sound. I just love that sound so much, and was definitely one of my favorite sounds of all time to have. But of course there's still many bands that I enjoy in Epitaph, though, like Fake Names. I kind of enjoy Honey. It's not my favorite band ever, but I like the band. But I do enjoy Fake Names a lot. I definitely think they're one of the best bands on Epitaph at the moment. And if you haven't heard of them, check them out. I definitely recommend them if you're looking for great new bands that are in the punk rock scene or the pop punk scene or whatever. I highly recommend you check them out. And some of the new Pennywise material. The most recent Pennywise album, Never Gonna Die, was actually a pretty killer album if you ask me, and I definitely recommend that as well.